You're listening to Player Development, a channel focused on the intersection of sports and character growth. Please like and subscribe to support the stories being shared, the growth of our listeners, and to stay up to date with our latest content. Hey, what's up everyone? This is Isaiah, and we're here to talk about the Washington football team and our relationship with sports. So today, the formerly Washington football team, formerly Washington Redskins, have unveiled their new logo and mascot. They're now the Washington Commanders. So I have not looked into the whole process of what went into that name. I personally think they could have done better, but that's not the point of this video today. I want to go through a little bit of background on why the name change and some of the history that's gone into this. So apparently this Washington football franchise had been the Redskins for 87 years. Then in 2019, in the wake of the George Floyd protests and all of these movements for racial justice, rekindled this conversation about the use of Native American imagery and logos in sports teams. And so Dan Snyder at the time, the owner of the team, decided that this team would no longer be called the Redskins. They would be known as the Washington football team in the interim while they went through the process of asking the community, asking for other input to decide on a new name and logo for the team. Now, there have been a lot of controversies and discussions, strong feelings on both sides on whether the name change is necessary, and bewilderment that the name had stuck for so long. And so one of the dissenting voices throughout this process was Jay Gruden, one of the former head coaches of this football team. And like a lot of people, I think he gave voice to a lot of people who are citing the idea of tradition and memories for players and fan base of specifically the Redskins name, and not wanting to part ways with that. So first of all, as we talk about our relationship with sports, a lot of times we want our teams to stand for and mean what we want them to mean. And what I'm saying by that is that, okay, you can cite tradition when it comes to this franchise of football, and maybe you have a lot of tradition and memories wrapped up in specifically the name the Redskins. That doesn't mean that that name stops having a different impact on other people. So while you perceive it one way, we don't get to just define terms however we want them to mean just in the sports world. Outside the context of sports, or even in the context of sports, Redskin still has a derogatory history as a racial slur for Native American people. And so, there might be some dissenting opinions saying, like, why do you got to bring race into it? This team has been around for so long that, it's divorced itself from the historical origins of the meaning of the name. And while that may be true for some people, it tends to be those people who are in the majority who have the luxury of divorcing the historical origin from what they currently want it to mean. And we don't just get to decide what something means or what impact it has with impunity. And another difficult example to talk about, we have the Confederate flag that for some people it represents Southern tradition and Southern culture and historic value and tradition and things like that. And for other people, for a lot of people, it stands for white supremacy. It stands for rebellion. It stands for dehumanizing other people. And so we don't just get to say, oh, it means this for me, and so we'll just stick with it, and that's okay. So another opinion that comes up is that the use of Native American imagery and terms like Redskins actually celebrates Native American culture. And we don't just get to decide what we do with these names and terms. So if we want to celebrate Native American culture, can we do a little better than using a historically racial slur to refer to a group of people that have been unequally treated, enslaved, destroyed by an oppressive majority. To me, just historically, that doesn't make sense to go from, okay, we're going to use this term to demean a group of people, but now when we use it for our football teams, suddenly it elevates them and we can celebrate their culture. It just doesn't translate that way. And so I'm glad that they eventually got around to the name change. Some people say it was a long time coming. Some people say the owner, Dan Snyder, only changed the name because companies started dropping the Redskins logo and not selling merchandise and things of that nature with that logo and imagery on it. One of the articles that I read said that that may be true, that maybe Dan Snyder only did the change for financial reasons, so he could continue licensing the merchandise and making money off of ticket sales and good publicity and things like that. Whatever the primary reason for the change was long overdue. And that article further went to state that it was not necessarily the companies or Dan Snyder that made this change. It was the grassroots organizations, it was the people who made their voices heard, nonprofits working for equal rights and racial justice, that made that a possibility, that made it a priority for those companies to put that kind of pressure on Dan Snyder to make that positive change. And I think what we need to remember, that this is the literal smallest step that any team in the NFL could take to move towards racial justice towards Native Americans. Okay, this is not the end of the road for any activists or for people who care about the rights of oppressed people. A name change is great, it's a great gesture, and it's the start of something good. But if we stop there, we ignore the lines of generational trauma and the current economic inequalities and health disparities and just opportunities available to Native American populations for those who are dealing with decades and generations of mental health, trauma, displacement, and injustice. I like this first step. I hope that the Washington football team can do something more with that. One article that I read pointed out something that seems really obvious in hindsight, but people who bought Redskins merchandise also bought Washington football team stuff and now are going to buy Washington Commanders stuff. And this is my idea, but what if the Commanders were to donate a portion of those proceeds from those merchandise and licensing sales to nonprofits and organizations that are working towards racial justice and equity and supporting Native American populations? What if this Washington football franchise were able to use this as an opportunity to educate people on why this name change was necessary? What were the real historical and social origins of this slur that became the name of a football franchise for almost 100 years? Why was that change necessary? And how are we moving forward and growing through all of that? So what's the final takeaway from all this? Knowing that there have been people and organizations working for decades to make this name change possible, to not belittle that as a trivial thing or just people being sensitive about the use of a term that, we might say has evolved or is now outdated or whatever, but that these people were able to organize and move towards justice and move towards positive change and influencing businesses and huge organizations along the way, that all of our efforts towards making sports a better place, a more inclusive place, a more equal place, a more just place, are not wasted efforts, and they're not just pipe dreams. That real change can happen, and it can start at the individual level and grow as we all seek justice together.